Hi, everybody, and welcome. My name is Jen Elder. I'm the director of the SAMHSA Homeless and Housing Resource Center, and I am thrilled with so many people joining us today for our webinar on Introduction to Hoarding Disorder. I'm going to start with just a few housekeeping slides, then we're going to get straight into the discussion. Next slide. HHRC is funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, but a quick disclaimer that the views and opinions expressed today are those of ours, the presenters, and not necessarily reflect those of SAMHSA or HHS. Next slide. We do have interpretation today by American Sign Language interpretation by Abby and Stacy. So we thank them for joining us. We also have live human transcription today by Rhonda. So we appreciate her time as well. If you're having any technical or accessibility issues today, please reach out to us. It might be the quickest to get us by adding a note into the Q&A, and that'll come right to our team and we can help. Next slide. So with this group, all participant lines will be muted. You won't be able to use your cameras today. We have a large group and the chat feature is disabled. But that said, we really want to hear from you. We are thankful to all of those who submitted questions before the webinar. I think we received something like 2,000 questions before today's webinar. There is a lot of interest in this topic. But that said, we want to hear from you today too. So you can use the Q&A feature to send those questions to us, react if you want to send messages to the presenters saying, you know, wow, this was great. That's a great feature. We'll make sure to get all of that to them during and after today's presentation. The slides are available now on the website. We'll make sure to put the direct link to those that web page in the chat for you. And a recording will be available. We're actually going to try to get that recording out to everybody this week. So stay tuned for that. At the end of the webinar, there'll be a link to an evaluation, which will send you to a certificate of participation after you complete that. We don't offer CEUs today, but we do provide that certificate for you. Next slide. So before we get started, I wanted to preview a very exciting upcoming resource from HHRC. Due to the immense excitement and interest in this topic, we are going to be releasing an online course on Introduction to Hoarding Disorder. And it was informed by the speakers that you're going to hear from today and authored by that team. And so it contains just fantastic information. And I want to thank you, the HHRC community, for suggesting this to us. Like you have been telling us over the last couple of years that this is a real need in the field. And so we're so excited to get that to you. It'll be free, self-paced, open to the public, and this will be accredited for CEUs from the National Association of Social Workers. So stay tuned. If you are not on our listserv, we'll also drop the link there for you to join, and you'll be notified of the release via that. So with that, that is all the announcements I had. I'm going to turn it over to today's moderator, Jack Tsai, who's been a partner with HHRC over the last few years and has been leading this great work. Jack.
Thanks, Jen. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon or good evening or good morning, wherever you are. Very exciting session we have today. Just by way of introduction, I'll be the moderator. My name is Jack Tsai. I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and I currently serve as a professor of public health at the University of Texas. And I've been involved in providing clinical services to homeless populations for several years, but now mostly involved in research and policy work related to homelessness. So the session we have today, the format will be, we have 4 presenters, really exciting qualified presenters. So they'll present for about an hour, 15 minutes each per presentation. And then we'll have 30 minutes at the end for Q&A. Thanks to everyone that sent in questions. I have a list of questions I prepared, but we can take more questions as time allows. So our 4 presentations today, I'll just briefly mention the topics, and then I'll introduce each of the speakers as they present. So we'll be covering 4 topics. The first topic will be assessment, diagnosis, prevalence of hoarding among homeless populations. The second topic will be discussing the collaboration between clinical and non-clinical staff in treating hoarding. The third topic will be discussing an important aspect of hoarding, which is eviction prevention from hoarding. And then the fourth topic will end with discussion about the treatment of hoarding. Okay, so with that, let me introduce the first speaker who's going to present on the assessment, diagnosis, and prevalence of hoarding. And the speaker will be Dr. Astria Grieg. Dr. Grieg is a clinical psychologist who trained at Yale and also within the Veteran Affairs healthcare system. She has worked in the nonprofit healthcare space with a focus on providing mental health care to people experiencing homelessness or housing instability and working with diverse populations. Her current role is clinical regional manager in primary care behavioral health integration and program lead for outpatient group therapy at Cambridge Health Alliance. With that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Grieg.
Thanks so much, Jack. It's great to be here. So I'll be talking about homelessness and hoarding, particularly about hoarding first itself, and then we'll talk about hoarding within the homeless population, mentioning prevalence and assessment. So when we think about hoarding and hoarding disorder, there's often a bit of a question: what is hoarding and how does it become hoarding disorder? When does it become hoarding disorder? So hoarding itself is just simply the excessive accumulation of personal possessions, and it can become problematic. It might not become problematic. Some people just have, hobbies and collections, and, it doesn't become an issue. When it becomes an issue, when it becomes hoarding disorder, is a little more severe than that. It includes excessive collection, difficulty discarding items, and this excessive collection and difficulty discarding items creates significant daily difficulty in a person's lives. So they really have a hard time living day to day as they normally might be able to. What I have here on this slide is the DSM-5 criteria for hoarding disorder. What that is, for folks who may not know, is the DSM-5 criteria is what mental health clinicians or mental health providers use to make sure someone meets the criteria for a diagnosis. So this is just literally the checklist that people, mental health providers, will go off of when they're determining whether someone has actual mental hoarding disorder or not. So it's, again, that persistent difficulty discarding or parting with possessions, regardless of their actual value. Sometimes these items that people have trouble discarding don't have much actual, value, that most people in our society wouldn't think of it as a valuable item. And this difficulty is due to perceived need to save the items. There's often a great distress when thinking about discarding them, and especially when having to discard them. There's a great distress that happens. And this difficulty to discarding possessions results in excessive accumulation of possessions, right? And that excessive accumulation has a lot of clutter that's built up in living areas, and it really compromises the usefulness of a person's living area, a person's home. Unless if the person's living area is uncluttered, should only be due to other people intervening. So there has to be a lot of clutter in someone's home. Furthermore, further criteria is that the hoarding causes significant distress, like I mentioned, and that distress can happen in one or more major areas in someone's daily life. So their social functioning, their occupational or work life, other important areas. Basically, they have a difficulty maintaining a safe environment for themselves or others. The hoarding should not be attributable to another medical condition. So, for example, someone might lose their ability to move for whatever reasons, and so hoarding, sometimes might happen in that case when someone can't get around their home, but it should not be due to something like that. And also, hoarding might happen sometimes due to other mental health disorders, like, for example, depression, or some people might have developing dementia, right? And so we want to make sure, and the mental health clinician will make sure it's not one of these other scenarios that are involved here. So I'll share some examples of hoarding disorder really affecting a person's daily functioning. So for example, a home that has so many things that an individual cannot easily go from one room to the other, that they just can't access different parts of their home. Some rooms might be so cluttered that they can't even use a room at all. So some rooms might be totally just cut off and inaccessible due to stuff being there. Clutter might also block important things in a home. So like maybe a bed can't be used because there's just so much stuff on it, or a sink or a shower or an appliance in the kitchen. There might be some important things that people might need to use for their daily lives that can't be accessible, aren't accessible due to clutter and things blocking it. Sometimes people accumulate or collect food and or waste can accumulate, providing a really unsanitary living condition. So things can expire and go rotten or rancid, and then pests unfortunately get involved, and it's it compounds and compounds and adds more unsanitariness to a person's living situation and negatively affects their daily lives. And so here's some more areas where hoarding disorder can really impact a person's daily life. So like I was mentioning earlier, the person's personal or household responsibilities may be impacted because they can't do things around their home, like I mentioned. And because of not being able to do things around one's home, you might not be able to eat regular meals or sleep regularly or have good sleep quality. Your hygiene may be impacted because you can't assess these things in order to help yourself with your hygiene. Relationships can also be severely impacted. I'll speak about that more in a second. As well as our housing status, which I'll also talk about more. Our housing status is significantly impacted by hoarding, and that can contribute to homelessness, and also hoarding can happen after people exit homelessness and become housed, and we'll also talk about that as well today. And hoarding can also really impact a person's employment or ability to maintain a job. There's a lot of research that shows, or some research, but we need some more research that shows that hoarding, people who hoard have a harder time actually going to work for various reasons, harder time going to work as often as they should be. So they call out sick more or call out more. And that of course impacts your ability to pay the rent, pay the bills, and therefore your housing status. So all this kind of really, accumulates and is related to each other. And so like I mentioned, hoarding can really impact a person's relationships in their lives, their family members, right? So you might have family that maybe don't want to visit you, cannot visit you, feel like it's very impossible or uncomfortable, right, to visit a person in their family with hoarding disorder. They might not be able to visit because there's nowhere to sit or nowhere to literally physically be in a person's home. Or if there's, like I said, waste or, pests, that might also make it a very unsafe environment for a person to visit. And our hoarding can also impact neighbors. And so when someone's hoarding situation becomes really severe, people can neglect their homes, or if you're in an apartment, you can neglect your unit and to the point where it affects other people, like your neighbors. Perhaps there are smells or there's leaks. Perhaps you're, accumulating stuff that, is blocking hallways or driveways or going into another neighbor's yard, right? And so neighbors, it's not uncommon for them to also feel the impact of a person if they have a neighbor who has hoarding disorder. And likewise, hoarding can affect other people in the community for the reasons that I mentioned. And, if people are having trouble going to work or maintaining their housing, right, becomes more of a larger, kind of community issue. And so hoarding just doesn't affect a person individually, but affects really, many people around them in their social network. So now I'm going to share a little bit about common experiences with people with hoarding disorder. Real briefly, hoarding disorder tends to provide people with a real strong sense of shame. People who hoard have a strong sense of shame and often don't talk about their hoarding. And often people who hoard have no or little awareness of their hoarding, or they don't, they might be able to say that there is a lot of clutter, but don't understand the real significant seriousness of their hoarding. They might not see that it's really impacting their daily functioning, really impacting other people in their neighborhood, really impacting their family, really impacting their job. They might not see the seriousness of it. And because of this shame and or lack of awareness or both, people who hoard will often decline to engage in mental health treatment and decline to engage with, cooperate with housing services, city services, sanitation, what have you, in the city safety net, social services. They'll often decline this type of help. Sorry, this button's a little sticky there. And so let's talk about the hoarding prevalence. So hoarding disorder occurs in about 1.5 to about 5% of the general population. We know this from numerous studies that just look at the general kind of population in the US and other countries as well. So that comes out to about 2 out of every 100 people. So it's not uncommon, but it's not super common either. But certainly people will come across this in their work. If you're a clinician or not a clinician working in housing or with the homeless population, it's not unheard of. Demographically speaking, hoarding disorder generally occurs equally across gender, and it typically begins in adolescence and continues throughout one's life. We often slightly see a bit of a little more increase among older individuals, among elders. There's a few reasons why people think this might be the case. You might no longer work and are in your home more. There's not really a consensus as to why this might occur. Oftentimes when we're older, we might have a real change in our daily life. And so that change is a huge stressor, a huge adjustment. And so this goes to the next point. Hoarding often becomes apparent or worse after a major stressful life event or life change or even a trauma. So we've seen in a few research studies and also clinically, we see this, in real life where people might have an increase in their hoarding when there's a major stressful event that happens to someone, whether that's when you're older or when you're young. It could be any time throughout someone's life. So now let's think more about homelessness and hoarding disorder. So the hoarding disorder rates among the homeless population are really hard to examine, and therefore it's hard to really share, what is the prevalence among folks who are homeless and experiencing hoarding and or hoarding disorder. Hoarding, though, is something that definitely affects people who are experiencing homelessness, whether it's street homelessness, living, a rough sleeper on the street in an encampment, or whether someone is a sheltered homeless person, right? So living in a shelter or a residential program or what have you. So for folks who might live in shelters, they often are given, as many people here might know, a little locker to store their personal belongings. And often this locker is not enough space, right, to share all of one's personal possessions, what they need, right, things like medication and clothing and personal items, right? And this can become an issue when someone has too many things in their storage area or locker. I know a lot of people that I've worked with have had difficulties with the shelter staff that they've worked with complain about them having too much stuff, and it becomes an issue. It becomes an issue when people who live in shelters have things in the kind of walking areas and, in the hallways, because that impacts other people in their shelter, or the other residents, right? So like I said earlier, hoarding does not affect just one person individually, but also the people around them. So even, when you're living in a shelter, hoarding too many things can become an issue. This brings up a really important, more theoretical or ethical question. If someone is limited to just a locker, is that really hoarding? If someone has just, one little cubby hole of space that they can store their items in, are they really hoarding? And, that makes sense, right? If someone is, hoarding in a home that has rooms full of clutter that's impacting their daily life, that's way different than a person living in a shelter who's limited to one, little bit of a locker space. And so that's really comparing apples to oranges, right? What we want to maybe look at is whether or not the hoarding is impacting their daily functioning, causing them, continuous struggles and stress, right? And causing difficulty in their daily lives, even though it might not be fair, so to speak, right? That one person might have more space than another person's. Even homeless folks with a more transient lifestyle who might move from place to place, have their belongings in carts and bags and what have you, that can also involve a difficulty for that person as well. I know a woman who I work with who carries so much with her that it's caused her some health conditions because of the stress, the strain of carrying these items over and over, kind of rubbing against her bones, rubbing against her joints. She's developed health conditions because of all the weight and all the items that she carries. And so again, not really looking at how much stuff, but what the stuff does to the person's life, how impactful in a negative way does it impact their lives. Another way that hoarding can become an issue for folks experiencing homelessness are for folks who live in encampments or in tents. Again, I'm not thinking about like the volume of how much stuff they have, but whether or not it impacts their lives. And so when someone lives in a tent or an encampment, when there's too much stuff, unfortunately, that makes them less hidden. And then when they're less hidden, they're more likely to be seen by, police and social services, city officials, and they get caught, so to speak, right? And then that makes it unfortunate that then they are told to move, or unfortunately, many times their stuff is moved for them without their knowing, right? And it's very stressful and an awful experience. And so there is a lot of unfortunate stress that when that happens, when you're having too many items in one's tent and you're living on the street. So now I'll talk a little bit more about housing. So among folks who are housed but unstably housed, so meaning they're close to eviction, research has shown that 22% of folks are likely, of those people close to eviction, to having a hoarding disorder. And among people who used to be homeless but are now housed, like in supported housing, about 19% of those folks have been found to have hoarding disorder. And so this is 3 times higher than the general population. So we see that there is a bit of an increase of folks who are hoarding in the homeless or unstably housed population, formerly homeless or almost homeless population. There's more hoarding among these individuals. And eviction. Eviction is a really, really common issue among people with hoarding disorder. About 8 to 12% of people with hoarding disorder have a history of being evicted or being threatened with, or told they might be evicted. And that's for a plethora of reasons, right? It's because perhaps of their clutter, perhaps of their clutter kind of creeping into other people's space, perhaps of the unsanitary or unsafety, not safe conditions that it might create, right? Or perhaps because of their difficulty paying rent, because folks who have hoarding disorder are more likely to have trouble keeping their job. People with hoarding disorder are also more likely to be on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum as well. So there's a real plethora of reasons here why folks with hoarding disorder are more likely to be unstably housed. And so that's it for my end here. And I'm going to pass on the presentation to the next person.
Great, thank you for that presentation. So our next topic is going to be discussing collaboration between clinical and non-clinical staff in treating hoarding. And our speaker is Taylor Doan, who is the leading housing clinician at Pine Street in supportive housing program. Ms. Doan is a licensed social worker, and in her clinical role at Pine Street Inn, she partners with case managers, property managers, and outside providers to maintain housing for folks who have a history with chronic homelessness. In this role, she has worked with folks with hoarding disorders for the past 4 years and recently began work in shelter as well. I'll pass it over to you.
Awesome, thanks, Jack. I wanted to add too that I'm located in Boston, so if that's helpful at all for people to know regionally. But today we're going to focus on the collaboration between the clinical role and the non-clinical role, focusing specifically on direct care. All right, so I put this together knowing in mind that when you're treating a hoarding disorder, it never flows as perfect as like this flow chart makes it look, right? It's going to go out of order. It's never this consistent. And it's always going to look a little bit different. So I want to say that right off the top, but these are a lot of the common themes that I see when, especially when treating hoarding disorder. So the first is probably something most of you are already doing when you're engaging and working with your tenants, with your guests, with your clients, whatever your population might be. So you're observing the concerns in the unit. This is when you're just gathering information, you're taking it all in, whether it's through a wellness check, an inspection, or simply building relationships. You are noticing what's going on in their unit. If you're in shelter, you're noticing what's going on in their space. And if you're in the street, you're noticing where their encampment is and what's happening. As you're collecting this information, you're kind of just storing it all away until it bleeds into this next step of just the brainstorming phase, right? I like to start with the question of what's their level of insight. And so by that, I mean, you might have someone who's been experiencing hoarding behaviors for the past 10, 20, 30 years, who sees absolutely no problem with what they're doing. It is worked for them for their whole lives. So why do you have anything to say about it? And they are content with their living situation. And then you have on the other end of the spectrum, someone who is quite embarrassed and has a lot of shame with how their living situation has developed over time, knows that there's something wrong, but for whatever reason it might be, they're not able to address it. And so if you're on this end of the spectrum, I would think that you have more insight into the problem because you understand that it's a growing concern. You just might not have the tools or resources to address it. However, if you're on this other end of the spectrum, you're one of those individuals where you have little to no insight because this is how you've lived for so long and it has worked for you. The next question I like to ask is, what is the severity of risk? I think we come in with these such good but high expectations of what people need and what a healthy and safe living environment looks like. But if we're really focusing on risk and safety concerns, it's going to help us narrow in on what we actually need to address with an individual. When I'm considering safety, I like to look at safe pathways, making sure there's like not 10 power strips plugged into one or having blankets on them. If they have like a kitchenette, making sure their stovetop is not covered with things like paper or plastics. Smoke detectors are in the unit. So really prioritizing safety as like your primary goal helps you focus on which fire, I guess, to put out first. And then asking yourself, like, what are they capable of doing on their own? And inviting them into this question as well. So what I love to give the autonomy back to the individual. This is going to let them feel like they have the most control over the situation possible, and asking them, you know, whether it be through prompting or questioning, like, what do they think they can handle? And then when you check back in with them, if they haven't handled it or it hasn't been addressed, you might be able to realize, okay, we're going to need a little bit more help here, but I want to at least give them that option to try on their own. And this looks at like looking into if they're physically capable, if they're emotionally capable, do they have the resources to even clean or to throw things away? So what are they truly able to do on their own? The next thing is one that I think if you're in this training, you're probably already doing, because it's all about empowerment and advocacy. The fact that you're trying to learn about hoarding disorder and how to better serve your population says that you're trying to empower and advocate for your clients. I say this all the time, but direct care staff knows our tenants, knows our guests better than anyone, because you are the ones showing up day in and day out, seeing them in their worst, seeing them in their best. You know them best besides them. And through that experience with them, you have the opportunity to humanize what they're going through. Hoarding can happen to anyone. You could have like a pretty messy home and then go through a pretty traumatic life experience and not be able to take care of your house and home afterwards. It really knows no bounds. And then what's also just really important with that empowerment piece is acknowledging any change that's made throughout the process at all. So if you see that, you know, you had talked once about there being a lot of plastic on the stovetop, and then being able, the next time you come and you're seeing there's like less plastic on one burner, you're going to see that and reward it, celebrate it, recognize it as a success, because you showing that you're acknowledging these changes, any small effort made is going to go a really long way. And then finally, this is when you can add in clinical services. So if you have a clinician that you can work with, if there's a hoarding task force in your area, if there is, I know there's a lot. So there's like elder services, protective services, developmental disability services, all these kind of different things. These can all be added in. But what I want to say is like the meat of it all is done in these first 3 steps. And so don't lose out on that. And when you do loop in clinical, let them know what you've already done, because you have done so much to advocate for them and get them to the point where they're even accepting or considering services. You know what works for them because you've probably tried it. So for some folks, addressing and one area will maybe lead to nothing, maybe lead to an outburst, but maybe if you come at it from another perspective, it could be really helpful. For example, I worked with a couple who lived together and experienced hoarding, and an advice I always gave them was they had a couple of cats in their unit, and you were in if you mentioned the cats. So like if you tried to buddy up with them, if you noticed how cute they were, they'd be so much more willing to engage with you and even more willing to work on the safety of the home for the cats than they were themselves. So even just having that little bit of advice on the relationship you already have established when going into clinical services makes a world of a difference. One question I get a lot in this role is, how do we talk about it? It's incredibly uncomfortable, and it's so nuanced and so unique for every situation, very personal. And I think we've said this already, but like can carry a lot of embarrassment or shame. And so I like to recommend at the very least maintaining curiosity. Ask them about their belongings, ask them how long they've had it, where did it come from, what does it mean to them? Just use it as like a foundation to get to know them more. And then take the time to build the relationship and not just talk about the stuff. So even if your goal is simply to reduce clutter in someone's home or in their space, make sure that you're spending a good chunk of time on just getting to know the individual. It's going to go so much better for both of you if you're actually talking about life, if you're talking about the Celtics, if you're talking about whatever it might be, and not focusing on all of their stuff all of the time. A good reminder is that the client is the expert here, not us. So this is their room, their space. You know, their room might not ever look how we would want it to have it. But if we can get it to a place where it's at least safe, that is a huge win. And so being mindful of, they might have a certain way that they do things, and we kind of have to operate in that if it's going to at least get us to that end goal. Focus on their strengths. What are they good at? What are they inclined to do naturally? What have they already done in the past? Clear and consistent communication. So being direct with what you're asking of them, putting it in multiple forms of communication. So not just verbally, but having it written down, using calendars, using images to prompt someone, using it in their preferred language. I can't tell you how many times we see people receive these notices about their unit and it's not in their preferred language. It's really hard to know what someone's expecting of you if you're not communicating in a way that they understand. I had an individual who was diagnosed with autism, who also experienced hoarding disorder. And she did so much better when we printed out images of what a clean unit was supposed to look like what a clean stovetop was, what a clean bathroom was, because she was able to check and reference the two things as opposed to one, remembering on her own, or two, reading a little paragraph or checking off a box. Mirror their language. If you come in and you call everything in their space trash, or you're like, you don't really need any of these bags anymore, or whatever it might be. If they're calling these things my belongings, if they're calling these things my collection, use that language, because it's going to show them that you're listening, and it's going to show them that you value what they value. And then ask permission to touch anything in the unit. So that goes as far as if you're picking up things to help throw away, picking up things to help organize, but also if you're going to put your hand on something as you step over something else, ask to touch it. It will go such a long way to let them know that you view yourself as the guest in their space and that you value what their boundaries are. Because inherently, when treating hoarding disorder, a lot of the time their boundaries are taken away, and it can be very invasive of a feeling. And so when we can when you can bring that back in whatever way it looks like, I really do try to. So what's important to remember, though, is this cannot be done on its own or with just one person, right? Like, it is such a team effort. It is such a collaboration. So when clinical and case management are working together, you're able to remind the client of their goals and deadlines. You're going to use motivational interviewing to prompt this readiness for change. You might be partnering with property management if they're in housing. We do this a lot for our folks who live in supportive housing, that a lot of the time their hoarding behavior can lead to lease violations, evictions, notice to quits, notice to terminates. The best way to advocate for an agreement in court is just to show them that you're trying, show them that you're making active steps for change, and you'll be more likely to push off an eviction and give yourselves more time to fix it. Looping in outside providers is another huge way to collaborate. Like the question of, would medication be beneficial in this circumstance? Is there a medication for hoarding disorder? No, but is someone experiencing major depressive disorder and having difficulty getting out of bed and engaging? If they could be prescribed an antidepressant, would that maybe help them at least be able to get out of bed or have the conversations that they need to? So is there a way we can meet them in the middle with that? And then finally, outside agencies. And I kind of talked about this in the last slide, but looping in your elder services, your Department of Children and Family, your animal protective services, if you need to, whatever it might be, there's a wealth of services out there, and it's just a matter of finding them. There's also lots of Facebook pages and lots of like hoarding task networks in various cities. So if you search both of those, that can be helpful if you're coming at it from maybe a non-clinical perspective. And then finally, with shelter-based work, this can be also really tricky because it really looks different from shelter to shelter, right? But I think there's a couple ways that hoarding can be addressed in shelter. And the first is just clear communication, like we talked about, but posting multiple sheets or having multiple postings around the shelter with examples, but also with the visuals that we talked about, and then also in the variety of languages. But one thing I would recommend with this is changing it out monthly. So, I mean, the number of times that you walk by something and it just, you start to kind of get numb to it because you've seen it so many times. By switching these out and providing new postings to remind people how their space needs to be is going to be a big be really helpful for our more visual folks. And then on the other side of things is like, what support do these individuals need? Do they need help sorting or cleaning? Do they have access to the supplies they need? Is there an area where they could rent out cleaning supplies for an hour and go and clean their bunk and then come back? How can they try and do some of these things on their own if they don't feel quite ready to voice it to case management or voice it to res staff? Or is it a shelter-wide policy concern? Do you need to, as a team, define what are the expectations we're going to hold our guests to, and how can we make this more clear to them? And then finally, I like to come at it again from a risk management perspective, focusing on those safety concerns. I've found that a lot of the time when working with individuals, it can be really hard just to talk about cleaning up your space. But if you talk about the logic behind it of, we do need to be safe, you need to be able to leave your bed and exit the shelter. You need to be able to be accessed by an EMT for Narcan. If they can't access you in your bed, then what's going to happen? And so kind of focusing on those safety concerns might make more sense to someone who doesn't really understand why you would care if their room is clean or not. And coming back to like, do they understand why we're asking this of them? All that to say that hoarding really is best addressed as a team. It is such an effort of collaboration, of working together, and of advocacy for our clients. And it's going to take a long time. And so a lot of patience in there as well. but it can be addressed and it can be changed. It just takes a lot of creative solutions through it. And that's mine.
Thank you for that thoughtful presentation. And that's a nice segue to our next topic, which is going to be eviction prevention from hoarding. And the third speaker is Dr. Frances Matthew. She's currently the Associate Director of Behavioral Health at Pine Street Inn. Dr. Matthew was born in Brooklyn, New York, raised in Lynn, Massachusetts, and is the child of Haitian immigrants. She graduated from William James College with her doctoral degree in organizational psychology. She's also a licensed social worker and earned her master's of social work degree from Clark Atlanta University. In her current role at Pine Street Inn, Dr. Matthew oversees operations and clinical management of the housing stabilization team, which provides clinical support to individuals with histories of trauma, mental illness, and addictive disorders. With that, and I'll pass it over.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to get started. Sorry. I'm going to get back to my slide. All right. So one of the common questions that we get is when to intervene, right? So when it comes to hoarding, I think depending on your role with working with a client, you may know best if they have a previous history to catch the early warning signs. Oftentimes we are catching it at the tail end. So that looks like more so a safety hazard, right? Providers, prescribers, direct care cannot come into the house. They're at the stage of eviction. However, to be more preventative, what we can start looking at is the earlier signs, which is more so around level 2. Slight congestion of blockage at major exits, hallways, evidence of inappropriate animal control or odorous waste. So that might look like you're, not changing the kitty litter and having that smell stay for, around a week. You see plummeting and electrical systems aren't fully functionable. So you might start to see devices that aren't working, right? The stove isn't working, or, the coffee maker isn't working. At this time in stage 2, the person is still able to close the door, right? And hide that. There's still shame and embarrassment. However, they do feel as if they're able to manage it at this space. But that's also a good time for us to start looking at additional services. So this is from sometimes a landlord perspective. I also like to say, if you're working with a landlord, how to use certain terminologies. Many landlords, especially small private landlords, may not feel like they have the time to devote to self-education or mental health issues, nor to wait things out with a disruptive or non-paying tenant, right? So if you're in that place, we see that with housing. We can discuss reasonable accommodation. And if you're someone that's working with a tenant that is struggling with hoarding, and you also have a way to communicate with their landlord or the prospective owner, you can use the term reasonable housing. And we'll get to that in terms of what does that look like and what exactly it is. Oftentimes, what we see are how people react to eviction is by not responding, right? Or avoiding those notices. What I always like to say is, not responding to the eviction notice does not delay it. If anything, it takes away the tenant's voice. So depending on your role as well, I think it's helping advocate and just having that tenant be aware of that process. Now, I'm saying the word tenant because that's the scope and the label that we use for the people that we work with, but please feel free to use that label interchangeably. Sorry about that. In addition, one of the things to also be aware of is to distinguish between messy and hoarding, right? So hoarding is blocking a few exits, right? Interfering with ventilation, sprinkler systems, attracting pests or, improper food storage. You're opening the fridge and you're seeing things expired. And now it's also creating a hazard for other residents. Those are more signs, again, going back to when to intervene, looking at from a landlord perspective, when to use that reasonable accommodation, and also something to think about when it comes to eviction, how to respond to evictions. In Massachusetts, although again, we have people from all over, it is illegal for a landlord on his or her own to remove tenants and occupants from and their belongings from a tenant apartment, room, or home without first getting a court order. Only a sheriff or constable can move a tenant and his or her belonging out of the property. And I think that's a very important information to have because, again, going back to not responding to eviction notice, people will see that big red letter and just avoid it, right? But there is tenant rights, and this is, attached to a mental health disability. So there is ways such as using that reasonable accommodation to help assist and support the people that we work and serve for. Sounds a lot. So some of the tips for working with someone one-to-one can look like educate yourself with hoarding disorder, as we're doing right now, right? One of the things that we should not do is remove things without their consent from their home or their space. We're only likely to irritate, frustrate, or remove that rapport that we've built with them, right? Listen and use the same language when talking about their possessions. What that would look like is if they have a pile of paper and this is something that is memorable to them, using the same language. I think Taylor kind of spoke about that in the previous slide, mirroring their languages. What we shouldn't do is enable the behavior by saying, if you throw away those stacks of paper, I'll buy you a magazine. That's part of the enabling behavior. And also making sure that, we are aware of, it's not specifically the item, it's their connection to the what they value and the memory that it's attached to it. Focus on the safety aspect, that's always helpful. And to be aware that cleaning process does not happen overnight. This is something that we're going to discuss throughout the process in terms of what is safety, how does safety look like to them, and what are our expectations as well. Offering to help does not mean cleaning up after them. It has to be a shared responsibility. And again, encouraging the hoarder to seek professional help. We shouldn't expect perfection. This is a process. So as we're working with a tenant, it may not be up to our standards, but we have to have some sort of level of agreement. Now we're going to go back to a reasonable accommodation. I think I spoke about that earlier. So a reasonable accommodation isn't just a verbal conversation in terms of what are our expectations. It has to be reviewed in terms of looking at our policies and procedures. And part of having a reasonable accommodation is attaching some of these services. Who can help, right? So are we reaching out to animal protective services? Are we looking at cleanup companies? So again, because I live in Boston, Massachusetts, there is national websites such as Hoarding Cleanup that has a directory, but I would always encourage people to look at their local community services and providers as well. Housing lawyers, again, as we spoke about eviction, knowing the tenant's rights and understanding how we can help assist them. And that I'm going to skip. can also work with having that mental health professional to be able to attach the diagnosis to the client, and that helps with the housing lawyer when they're having to go to court and things of that nature. Elderly service is a service I use often. Love them. They're great as well. And as always, working with the public health department, oftentimes we see that people that are asking for the tenants to make these changes, it seems as it's a us versus them. But if you help work with the client, I think everyone wants the same thing, right? So looking at what are the local resources and how can we get them together? And I think I'm going to try to answer some of the questions. In addition to, these are just an example of some of the services that we could reach out for. Definitely adding in recovery coach as well, because some of these issues can be related to substance use, right? So it's not a one and done. It's, if we, in the best world, we can have a multidisciplinary team and get everyone's help and assistance with supporting this tenant.
Okay, thank you for that informative presentation. So our last presentation today is going to be covering treatment of hoarding. The speaker is Miriam Bayer. She's currently the director of the Psychosocial Rehabilitation and Recovery Center at the San Francisco Veteran Affairs Medical Center. Ms. Bayer is a licensed social worker who has worked for the VA healthcare system for 12 years. And she's been involved in providing direct clinical services to veterans experiencing homelessness. In her current role, she helps oversee a recovery community-based center at the San Francisco VA, which helps veterans obtain housing support and psychosocial rehabilitation services. She's worked on hoarding issues for 15 years and presented to national audiences about treating hoarding.
Thank you for the introduction. And I am excited to speak with you about some of the interventions and implications for care. Let me move forward in these slides. So some clinical considerations are vulnerabilities, such as biological, emotional dysregulation, poor health, certainly a history of loss and trauma, as some of the other speakers have mentioned. And there is almost always components of information processing deficits. So it is very common for people struggling with hoarding disorder to have issues with attention, categorization, memory, perception, and most fundamentally, decision-making difficulties. And I bring these up because they inform the sort of interventions that we use and demand that we seek a more holistic approach to treating this issue that really impacts the entire biopsychosocial sphere. And moving forward, a brief review of common meaning of possessions that we often see in hoarding disorder. Beauty. So these are individuals who see this aesthetic appeal in unusual objects. Memory is often a concern, this belief or fear that memories will somehow disappear without the physical object that contains the memory. Utility, opportunity, and uniqueness is a really common theme in my experience. So someone who can imagine the creative possibilities of 10 sheets of cardboard, an abandoned keychain on the side of the road, sentimental value, which can actually translate into some projection of almost human-like qualities, also known as anthropomorphism. Comfort and safety. I've talked to many veterans who describe building a literal nest out of their objects so that they feel protected from their external environment. And it serves as a ready excuse for avoiding connections with the social world around them. Identity, validation, and self-worth. This is the belief that objects are very much a direct physical extension of identity, and that when we are asking people to get rid of or make decisions about their possessions, we're challenging them to remove part of themselves. And this is why the response to interventions can be so emotionally fraught and so complex. Control, this concern that other people will control one's possessions or behaviors. And to echo comments of the previous presenters, this is why it is so fundamental to acknowledge ownership of the client, to ask permission, to be respectful, and to approach these interactions with sincerity and curiosity. And this is a little counterintuitive, but there is a key perfectionistic component to hoarding disorder. And this fear of making mistakes really can interfere with the decision-making process. A lot of people have strong beliefs about responsibility and waste, distrust of landfill systems or recycling approaches, and this idea that they have to do it themselves if it's going to be done correctly. The challenge is there are significant barriers to actually accomplishing these tasks, and so they tend to mount. And another consideration is the social element. People who go to garage sales, people who are at the grocery store every day shopping the sales, when they get to be known in their community, when they feel seen, this creates another social pull. And sometimes when we're asking them to change hoarding behaviors, we're asking them to change perhaps their only social connection. And again, these are considerations when we're treating hoarding so that we can develop a more genuine understanding of the background and some of these underlying concerns that can really dictate success in the intervention. And moving on to the next slide, I won't go into too many details about these sorts of problematic thinking styles. Some other language that we like to use in recovery-oriented programs are unhelpful thinking styles. You may have heard of them referred to as cognitive distortions. And these are the types of unhelpful thinking styles for which cognitive behavioral therapy is the most effective intervention. So addressing all or nothing thinking, and we can identify this sort of approach with words like most, everything, nothing, over generalization, so taking experience from one incident and generalizing it to all experience. Mind reading or jumping to conclusions, my personal specialty, catastrophizing, so anticipating the worst possible outcome, discounting the positive, and I'll review a few more on this next slide. Emotional reasoning, letting our emotional attachments sort of dictate our interpretation of facts. Moral reasoning, should statements, labeling, under and overestimating, and given the time limitations, I'll spend a little bit of time on the conceptual model of hoarding, which is one of the bases for interventions. We look at vulnerability factors, the information processing problems we had spoke briefly about, meaning of possessions, our emotional reactions, for example, the positive feeling someone might get when finding a deal or when identifying an object that they believe will further their collection. Negative reaction could be avoiding the discomfort of having to make decisions about what to discard and what to keep. And all of these emotional reactions become positively reinforced or negatively reinforced. And all of these elements contribute to what we see with their acquiring behaviors, their difficulty discarding, and the clutter in their home, which really disrupts basic living. These are some clutter image rating scales that I'll mention just because they are readily available online. They can be really helpful tools to bring awareness to an individual about what their space looks like. Clutter blindness tends to be an issue that we see, and at least with the individuals I've worked with, they tend not to notice. Their brains adapt to the clutter and it becomes normal, typical. Here is another clutter image rating for living room, another for kitchen. And I have some case examples based on my experience. Unfortunately, we won't have too much time to get into these today. But this is just to give you a bit of a taste of just the vast range of personal experiences and how the landscape of hoarding and cluttering disorder can look so different from person to person, which is why these interventions become more critical. As the other presenters mentioned, rapport building and trust is absolutely critical. As much as possible, we want to use a curious and a non-judgmental approach. There is so much shame and hiding with hoarding disorder and cluttering behaviors that we want to normalize the discussion. We want to validate the experience and open up the topic, bring it into the sunlight. We know that cognitive behavioral therapy and exposure therapy tend to be the most effective interventions for hoarding disorder and cluttering behaviors. While there's definitely a need for additional research, on average, in successful situations, you can have a reduction of symptoms about 30%. Rules for acquiring and discarding, questions for acquiring and discarding kind of inform these approaches. And it's also important to mention the uncomfortable reality is that the prognosis can be quite poor. And so early intervention is really critical when possible. I lost my slides here. Another intervention before I wrap up here. Be mindful of language. Again, use the language that the individuals provide. We really use here at the VA a strengths-based, veteran-centric model so that we can always refer back to the individual's goals and ask the question, is this decision to keep, discard, donate, gift, will this move you closer to your goal or further away? Psychoeducation is critical. Addressing safety issues, preparing for inevitable ruptures. This is an intense experience. We are asking people to allow us into the most intimate details of their lives, and we want to be prepared for a rupture and how we can also approach repair. Guided exploration of emotional, cognitive, and behavioral factors, a collaborative practice, creating an exposure hierarchy for treatment. So starting with kind of the low stakes items and also working toward the bigger items, the things that are more disruptive to their lives. Targeted objective setting with SMART goals. For those of you who are not familiar, SMART goals are specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time limited. And this really helps to focus the goals. We want to lean into this discomfort. And one of the phrases I often use is, if you're getting uncomfortable, then we're headed in the right direction. And sharing space with the individual for that discomfort. And that, of course, is part of exposure therapy. Enlisting as many clinical and natural supports as possible, engaging advocacy resources, and approaching services like adult protective services when necessary, and balance, and really leveraging your relationship with the individual to make progress. And I will wrap up there in the interest of time. Thank you all for your attention.
Aaron, thanks a lot. There were some tech issues. I don't know if you managed to cover all the material you wanted. I just want to make sure you were able to cover all the content in the slides.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, great. Okay. Well, thanks to all the presenters. So I think we're going to move into the Q&A session, and I see there's a lot of questions. Let me stop the screen share here at least. And maybe the speakers can turn on their cameras as we try to answer some of the questions. Okay, so let me pose a few questions I've found that some of the audience have sent ahead of time. And there was a common question about clients with kind of little or no insight about their hoarding issues and how to approach that.
I find that one is incredibly challenging, especially, and I think this ties into the question of like for folks who are not interested in receiving treatment. I like to start with like letting them decline. So if they say no, let them decline, but still building that relationship. A lot can be done once you actually have the relationship with them. And maybe you already do, but giving them the opportunity to decline and hearing that no, and not forcing them into a situation can go a really long way, but also not being afraid to bring it back up as time goes on and as it feels appropriate. I think if you're able to, and I think I said this in the comments somewhere, but like preserve someone's dignity and their autonomy by allowing them to decide to move forward, that can go a long way. However, I also can acknowledge and understand that there are times that we do have to intervene because the unit, the home, whatever it might be, has become so unsafe, so uninhabitable that if we don't do something, then the individual cannot continue to live there. And so if that's the case, I try to be as clear as I can and consistent with my language and let them know what the steps are going to be in place. So like being honest that, okay, we are going to have a full clean out of the unit. I know that this is going to be extremely difficult for you. And I know that this is not at all what you wanted, but unfortunately, because the unit is so unsafe now, we do have to do this. Is there anything that you want to make sure that we keep, that we maintain? How can we make you still feel like this is your home, even if we are having to come in here and change things? So if you do have to come in on that side of like, okay, we do have to intervene, letting them know how it's going to happen, giving them as much detail as possible, and then letting them choose to be a part of it or to not. I've had people say, okay, then if that's the case, you can do what you need to do and I don't want to be here. And then they come back later, and it's incredibly dysregulating, but it's still their choice on how they want to participate.
That's really helpful. Do any of the speakers want to add to that?
I think that was a great answer.
Okay, so another question that came up is, and hopefully somebody knows the answer to this, but what are reasonable accommodations, especially in terms of the American with Disabilities Act? You know, can hoarding disorder be used in terms of helping a client with accommodations?
I can talk a little bit more about that. So that's, I made it a point to say reasonable accommodation isn't just a verbal conversation between both parties. It needs to review the lease, right? Because the lease or housing document will probably have expectations to live there, right? So what we're asking for reasonable accommodation is one, educating the person that this is someone that has a mental health disorder, and that's where with the reasonable accommodation, being able to say, can we put a pause for a second so I can get the mental health provider to have the diagnosis to help us get the additional resources that we typically need. Sometimes in order for things to move, we see that we need that diagnosis for them to have resources that are affordable to them. If not, technically, yes, anyone can get a cleaning service to come in. But as we spoke about before, most of the clients that are struggling and dealing with hoarding come from low economic standard places.
I'll also add that when you involve a mental health professional, that mental health professional will put a diagnosis into paperwork, that the paperwork can be given to the housing site or the city, and then the city or housing site could see that there is an actual mental health diagnosis, and again, that provides them the kind of the permission to give them more reasonable accommodation, meaning like you might extend the time that they are allowed to clean their unit before eviction, or maybe it's they're allowed to have this or that condition. So when you have this paperwork from a mental health professional, there's stipulations that the mental health professional can put in through the document that'll help them perhaps avoid eviction, that the housing site can follow.
Great, thank you.
Can I add something too?
Yeah.
I would also say too, from like a landlord's perspective, or what property managers have said to me, is that a reasonable accommodation still has to be reasonable. So what's tough about that is because they're in a lease, because they have this disorder, we can't just then request like, okay, we would need an entire new unit or an entire new house or whatever it might be, but it does need to be within the realm of possibility. So that's important to note. And then if they are being evicted for hoarding, the reason why they can do that despite like this being a diagnosis and a disability is because it becomes a safety thing. So it's like if the house is uninhabitable, or it could, if it's deemed as a fire risk for all the other units in the building and things like that. So I think it's definitely worth filing, because it can, like Estrella was saying, like lengthen the eviction process and just give you more time, but there are some limitations with it.
Great, thank you. There's questions about kind of cultural nuances to hoarding disorder, and I guess I would expand it to cultural considerations when providing treatment too.
I can at least attempt to speak about this a little bit. I think that one of the themes that has emerged in my experience is how childhood trauma certainly can inform hoarding behaviors later in life. We know that there is some genetic component, or we strongly believe there is some genetic component, but I would say some of like the psychosocial cultural elements can include, socioeconomic status, food insecurity, histories of homelessness. We've worked with people who had parents who grew up in the Depression era, where you use every single piece of clothing until it disintegrates. When, at least in the veteran community, we've identified, certain themes about military service that contribute. The idea that you finally get to make your own decisions about what items you have after you leave the military. But I would say, based on the research, there's no, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but like no specific cultural considerations, and instead there seems to be a much heavier emphasis on trauma, socioeconomic status, and access to resources.
I think that's right. And also we see hoarding across cultures, across the globe. It happens in all places.
Great, thank you. We have a question about what are realistic timelines for change when addressing hoarding?
Slowly but surely. It takes time. It's not an easy task. You want to, as all our presenters here said today, build rapport, maintain the rapport, don't break the rapport, always focusing on that first and foremost, and being clear and having real small manageable steps. And it may be a long ride, and that's the nature of treating folks with this unfortunate condition. It may take a while, but as a team, we can not feel that kind of burden as an individual treating or helping someone, and work as a team. And hopefully we can get there bit by bit, also focusing on safety first and foremost, instead of thinking it as like just curing or getting rid of hoarding altogether. Really focusing more on safety, as a major goal is much more useful and precise and easier and important.
And also, I would just add, incorporating a relapse prevention plan can be very helpful. We do know from the research that after a major clean out, for example, in which the tenant or the individual does not participate, that they tend to acquire twice as much, twice as fast. So really preparing for contingency plans and relapse prevention as well.
I have a kind of tricky question for you guys. Some people have asked, is there any kind of a circumstance in which you would encourage the landlord to evict the client? Or any kind of circumstance in which you would go clean out someone's belonging kind of just on your, as a provider on your own?
I don't think a provider on their own would do that, because there might be safety issues, right? You don't know what you might come across. So again, working as a team. And that's really a difficult thing, right? Because like many folks said, if you just take away someone's belongings, that's really distressing. It can make someone's mental health status worse. And then that might lead you into a bigger problem. Again, I might start focusing more on a smaller goal that is, maybe something that could be collaboratively come up with the person, the individual, and take it from there.
I also wanted to add to that, legally, a landlord or a provider cannot remove belongings from a tenant's place. It has to be court ordered, and it has to be the sheriff that comes in and does that process, just because, as we spoke about before, sanity, levels of sanitation and things of that nature can sometimes be subjective. So we want to make sure when we get to that stage, it's because we've done everything and anything, right? And not just one person making that decision to remove the person's belonging. And we already know housing is difficult in general. So where would we even put that person after we evict them? So I would highly not recommend removing anyone's belonging from their place.
There's questions around common co-occurring disorders. Specifically, some folks have asked about OCD, ADHD, post-traumatic stress disorder, borderline personality disorder, substance use disorder. How should folks think about these co-occurring disorders?
There's a lot of co-occurring disorders with hoarding disorders. So depression, PTSD, OCD. Hoarding disorder used to actually be a subset of OCD. Now it's own separate individual disorder. And so there's a lot of overlap between some disorders as well. And so there may be chances or cases where an individual has one or more of these disorders. It's not impossible. And working with mental health professionals, making sure that they're working with the mental health professionals and their team and your team, to keep them all happy and healthy. That's the way to go.
And I'll just add anecdotally, in my experience, there is almost always a history of trauma of some kind as sort of a triggering event or a series of triggering circumstances for when the hoarding behaviors and collecting behaviors start. Whether that meets the diagnostic criteria for PTSD or not is a different question, but I would say being mindful of a very likely history of trauma can only improve your work with an individual.
Absolutely. And homelessness in and of itself could be the traumatic situation for many, right? Becoming homeless, losing all of your belongings in your home. And sometimes transitioning from being homeless to getting housing, that transition can be really rough for a lot of individuals. And I'm sure folks here have that experience as well. And that could be a major stressful event too for some folks that contribute to it.
How can staff keep themselves safe when helping clients without being offensive or insensitive?
I'll jump in just to say what we do during home visits as clinicians is we prepare them for exactly what to expect. And I think that includes concerns about safety, sort of making observations. I noticed that, several of your doorways, you have possessions that go up pretty high. How do you suggest we navigate that during the home visit? Or how do you usually get to your sleeping area? And if it's warranted, I'll be honest about my safety concerns and say, I got to tell you, I'm a little worried about, the black mold on the ceiling. What do you typically do? Or how do you manage sort of fire risks on your own? I've noticed that XYZ. So sort of sharing your observations, being genuine about your concerns can certainly elicit some guardedness or maybe some defensiveness, but I feel like that can also go a long way into exposing the reality of their circumstances and trying to solidify your concern for their safety and based on your experience. And I will say that almost everyone is categorically opposed to home visits. And maybe they haven't had anybody in their living space for decades. But when they realize that you are an ally in support of their goals, I've had everyone come back later and say, it wasn't as terrible as I had imagined. I actually feel a great sense of relief, like this sense of urgency around hiding their circumstances can be lifted. And so again, I just feel like genuineness and transparency are always the way to go in these clinical interactions.
There are several questions about hoarding animals and wondering if any of the speakers have any experience with that.
Animal hoarding is very serious, and you can certainly hoard animals, and that is the item or the thing that you hoard that contributes to your hoarding disorder. Like I mentioned before, there can be pests that accumulate when we hoard like food, and also with animals, right? Because they're waste, and then the waste becomes really unsanitary, and that actually expedites the unsafety of their home and causes more concerns for their health and other people's health who might visit the home as well. It makes a more serious situation in most cases.
And I want to add, simply removing the animal doesn't solve the problem. If anything, sometimes that might increase, the level of stress and behaviors that follows. So that's why, of course, it's important to kind of coordinate that care and make sure that they're aware of this, because no one wants to hear a knock from the animal service and see that their pets are being taken away that same moment. Kind of what someone said earlier, just making sure it's a wraparound service. They're prepared for this. You know, there's a follow-up session before or after, and someone's present would probably be the best approach. So this is not something that they have to endure by themselves and possibly be re-traumatized.
Great, thank you. Now, I think there's a pretty high relapse rate for hoarding disorder. And so say a client's been helped with their hoarding issue, but what do kind of providers and family members have to think about in terms of preventing that relapse?
That's when well, first, I think it's important to acknowledge before like the big clean out even happens, because I feel like sometimes it happens and then there's nothing set in place for when it's done. And then you're just kind of left scrambling and trying to figure it all out. So definitely having that plan in place beforehand is important. And then I would add too that, and I saw this in the chat a lot, is like how people pay for these like ongoing services too. And I think like going through your insurance is a one way to do it. So there are services that can be provided through insurance that your provider can request on your behalf. And they can come in for like weekly cleans, like a home health aide or a PCA. And so that weekly clean can also help with the maintenance that they might need, maybe getting in additional services like laundry and food as well. Just making sure those basic needs are met can go a very long way. But then also making sure that like, if you're the case manager or direct care, that you're following up with them. And if we notice like some of these the repetitive behaviors coming back, acknowledging it and seeing if we can kind of catch it a little earlier, as opposed to waiting until it gets to the point of hoarding or squalor again.
Anybody want to add to that?
I think also, I just want to acknowledge provider burnout, caregiver burnout, family and friend support burnout, which can absolutely be a barrier to care. I mean, it is, especially for friends and family, it can be incredibly difficult to witness a loved one living in these sorts of conditions, and maybe they feel like they've exhausted all of their approaches and they're not making any progress. And I think that accessing supports for providers and family and friends of the individual can also go a long way in addressing sort of the the ripple effect of stress that can result from these situations. So making sure everyone has support to manage burnout, disappointments, barriers to access.
Great, thank you. Well, we have only a few minutes left. I want to give the speakers an opportunity to answer any questions that you thought you wanted to answer that I probably missed. Okay, if there's no other, unfortunately, we can't. There's a lot of good questions, and we don't have time to answer all of them. But you have the contacts of the speakers, and feel free to contact them and they can respond at their convenience. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Jen to close out the session.
Thanks so much, Jack. And thank you to all of the panelists. I learned so much during this webinar. There was a lot of great feedback in the Q&A from participants. We'll make sure we get that to you. Just so many tangible things that we can take and use in our work. So huge thanks to all of you for your time in putting this together. If we didn't get to your question, we received like almost 400 questions during this webinar. So I'm sorry, we did our best, but that tells us that this is something that you want to know more about. So again, we're launching our online course on Introduction to Hoarding Disorder later this month. You can find out via our listserv, so there'll be more information. And then as a team, we'll talk about how we can advance this and really address all of those fantastic questions that came in. So again, huge thanks to the panelists today. Huge thanks to the HHRC community for joining us. And we will see you again at our next webinar. Thanks so much.